Well, a salon of the Center for Human Emergence is not a debate or a discussion. We see it as an inquiry in which we are listening to each other, to our inner voices and to the voice of the whole. And as a kind of start for this, what we call second tier communication, I will start with our purpose and principles. The purpose of the Center for Human Emergence has been changed, and at this moment is formulated like applying spiral dynamics and the integral model on actual societal developments. Just as we are going to do tonight. At least here it is tonight. In other places it will be the afternoon or the morning. And we have 6 principles that we use as a kind of guidance for our work. And these are, first, we assume oneness. Second, we acknowledge natural order in all life. Third, we enact the role that is ours to play. We act when the time is right, and we hold when it's not. We clarify creative tension until new insight emerges. And the last one, we act from mutual trust and are accountable to each other and the whole at all times. So this is also, I think, the spirit in which we have our meeting today. And Hans, I will give you the word for introducing Marcelo.
Yeah, welcome. It's a joy to meet you all here. Yeah, I met Marcelo last year at the European Integral Conference, where he had an inspiring online workshop about Brazil. And then we met each other and his colleagues from the Integral Institute, Brazil, later last September in Sao Paulo. So we had a constellation workshop about the history and culture of Brazil. Yeah, and there are so many developments going on in Brazil, so that we thought it might be very interesting to have a little bit more insights and put the focus on it to understand what's going on there and what we might learn from it. So Marcelo Cardoso, he has had leadership positions in various companies over the last 5 years. He founded the Instituto Integral Brasil, and in the past he works together with Don Beck. He's associated with Ken Wilber, and he is currently developing transformation projects in organizations using methods based on integral theory. So Marcelo, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. You will help us better understand some specifics of Brazil's history and culture, but also what we can learn from the dramatic events your country has faced in the last week. So Marcelo will give us an introduction. Then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. Then we will have a short break, and then we will meet in small groups to digest Marcelo's impulses and come back together and have a collective sharing. So Marcelo, where are you?
Thank you everyone. Boa noite para os brasileiros aqui. I think what I'd like to share, of course, it's my perspective, and I hope it can open up conversation to us together, holding and taking, seeking and coordinating perspectives in a way that we can increase our capacity to make sense and meaning out of everything that we are facing. So Hans, I'm gonna have 25 minutes, right?
25 minutes, 30 minutes, yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna share a PowerPoint just for the sake of guiding us throughout the conversation. And if anyone would prefer that I walk through all of the slides and then we open up for Q&A, or if I open up for people to stop me, what is the best way of you guys doing it? I think you're on mute.
So afterwards we have a conversation after your presentation. Then we have 15 minutes Q&A. So please go on.
Okay, so before I jump into share a little bit of perspectives around Brazil, where we came from and how we are facing the current situation, a little bit of the story of Integral in Brazil. I launched Instituto Integral Brasil back in 2010, but Integral Brazil is being present since spectrum of the consciousness was translated and actually was through the transpersonal movement in Brazil, and then we somehow were following the initial movements of the Integral Institute and Spiral Dynamics in connection with it. I know that most of you are connected and somehow invested in Spiral Dynamics. I was just sharing with Hans that I met Don Beck a couple of times. Actually, I also met Chris Cohen in Brazil. So when I studied, I was certified in Spiral Dynamics, and then I've been evolving throughout of those years, and then back in 2010, we got the green light from Ken Wilber to setting up a chapter of Integral Institute in Brazil. And right now, and I think this is pretty much what I believe, there is a growing momentum in the world for the narrative of Integral, helping us to create meaning and better understanding of the challenges we are facing. But I think the only way we can do that, it is through being able to talk to a different community. So I'm very engaged with the TRU community from Otto Scharmer, and from a group of people from that study and apply complexity from David Snowden and also there is this growing movement of that started with Rebel Wisdom, and now those guys are everywhere. I think there are a lot of different groups talking about meta crisis and how we are facing the crisis and how we are gonna handle it. And then I pretty much believe in the capacity to those different movements being able to articulate some level of convergence on aspects that people agree. My experience is that most of the time people tend to focus on the divergence of the movements and then create their own lingo and separation. I firmly believe there is this possibility of creating this meta conversation among all those movements, and Integral is one of them. So a little bit about Brazil, just information. Brazil is very large. It's still the largest biodiversity in the world. That's why I think there's so much conversation about Amazon in the context not only biodiversity, but actually climate change, which I think it's a more urgent agenda, although biodiversity is also even more important in my own perspective. Also water. Brazil is the largest reserve of fresh water in the world. And although all the tragedy of the last 4 years, we still have a lot of preservation, and we still have an opportunity to refocus Brazil from a different perspective. But we are one of the most unequal countries in the world, and actually it is part of our history and how we dealt with the traditional original indigenous, and also particular slave ship, which I think is the biggest karma or the biggest trauma we have in our history. It created this huge inequality. Now, again, after 4 years of tragedy, we're just seeing now more and more stuff being uncovered. So people say that 33, Brazil has 220 million people inhabitants. Some statistics is saying that we have 30 million people starving right now, and up to 120 million people somehow with some level of food insecurity. So it is, our challenges are very big in terms of the social. We still have a very renewable energy matrix, particularly because during the military regime, most of energy projects, power plants were based on hydro, on rivers, on hydraulics. And also there was this program back when in the oil crisis during the 70s and the 80s that Brazil invested in the ethanol, the sugarcane, alcohol, that is part of how Brazil full the fleet of cars. Although in the last 10 to 15 years, the thermal mineral coal and oil are growing to kind of balance the matrix, but we still I think the biggest problems in terms of emissions for Brazil is not the energy, but cattle and the size of the cattle production. So actually we have some very poor statistics in terms of corruption. Fake Brazil is, I think, is the paradise for fake news. I think after the US, Brazilians we love to create and foster and nurture fake news. Also, we have a kind of a war every year in terms of homicides, particularly because of the organized crime. It is a tragedy, and more than 70% of these people being killed every year are Black, which is also part of the challenges we have, the structural racism. And also, although we have this huge challenge in terms of wage income and working, we are facing the same issue of Brazilians being unhappy with work and rethinking their relationship with work. Also, we have at a positive side, Brazilians commit a lot to volunteer work and being solidary. We also have, despite of the inequality, Brazilians are willing to give. And there was this, I think was the first time that billionaires in Brazil made a movement to really donate money, which I think it was something new for us. So I think that although what I'm going to present now is part of the timeline of Brazil, and talking about spiral dynamical terms, which I agree with Ken Wilber that green in power is not being able to create solutions at a level of democracy, economy, social environment that integrate. So green are more fragmenting. That's why I think we are facing the challenge we are facing, because we are somehow leaving behind blue and red that are very present in the society. And I think when in 2013, Brazil had a social movement against, at that time was Dilma being president. But it was a social movement quite similar to Occupy Wall Street, the spring in the Middle East, and so kind of similar movements that happened in between 2006, 7, and 2015 that ended up creating. I like this idea that comes from complexity, that when you have a chaotic movements like those social movements have back in there, when the energy of the chaos fades away, the system reorganized in a more kind of retrocede, kind of going backwards. And that was, I think, was the entry point for the in the right narrative start growing in Brazil, because it, although was a movement started with a left narrative, ended up being caught by, and right after there was this big scandal of corruption that was led by a judge in Curitiba, which abusive corruption scandals, but the way it was handled really create side effects that we're still dealing with them right now. Then there was the impeachment of Dilma that just created even more space. Then Lula was arrested, and then Bolsonaro was elected. And then throughout of his term, Bolsonaro was always, although all the abuses and alongside with the abuses and everything that he did, he was always trying and threatening democracy. And in a very tight election back in last November, elected, was this story was so and then we just had a couple of weeks ago our own version of a Capitol, which I think was even worse than what happened in Washington DC, because there was more people in power that allow it to happen. It was so ingrained and melted and everything that was really hard. In my perspective, and I just did a podcast that I have around this left and right narrative, so talking in terms of integral. I don't like Lula either. I believe that most of the charge that was pressed against him in terms of corruption was correct. I think he lost a big opportunity in his lifetime to be a leader that actually Lula is the first leader in Brazil that came from poverty, came from a very poor origin, and made all his political career throughout of that. So he had all the opportunities to becoming the leader of the Brazilian history, which his story is amazing. He compromised himself in so many different ways, and actually we are starting seeing the limitations of his own leadership right now. But there is no and his flaws with Bolsonaro and actually Bolsonaro back to face to the worst of it's going back to the beginning of 20th century. With although Lula, we are back on the democracy. I think he's doing okay in terms of how he's dealing with the challenges. And actually, I think the good news is that he's bringing a lot of good people to his government in the areas such as government and the social. For the first time, we have a minister for the original people, an indigenous, a woman who has an amazing leadership, and the health and education. I think on those areas, we are gonna go back to the game. Although in some other, I'm not sure. And actually, I'm not sure, although Bolsonaro is weakening, the whole, so there were 58 million people who voted for Bolsonaro, and they are still all there. In the far right, as it is happening in many other countries, is still there, and we don't know the implications on the long term for this movement. So, but let me talk a little bit in terms of the integral and how we see everything that is going on, because I started, and I think we can see Brazil in terms of the mainstream conversation. We just had Davos last week in Switzerland, and also the whole Latin America is always a kind of a side conversation. It's not relevant enough. It's one way of seeing it. Although there is a possibility and opportunity for Brazil, instead of trying to mimic US and Europe, having a proposition of for future that is more grounded on the Brazilian values and the Brazilian history, and in my perspective and opinion, can inspire, can work for Brazil after 500 years, and at the same time can inspire the world for what would be a second-tier regenerative society. And then just taking the big three of the integral, first, second, and third person, in one hand, and I'm gonna explore this a little bit, in one hand, Brazilians are very open to spirituality, but on the other hand, we always fall into the pre-trans fallacy, being naive and childish in terms of our own spirituality. In one hand, more than diverse, Brazilians are mixed. Since the first meeting between Europeans and the indigenous, it got mixed as well with the African. There was enslaved here. So in one hand, there is this beauty of being more than diverse. On the other hand, the structural racism is so much worse and so much ingrained and so much hard to deal with, because it's not black and white. There is this big in between that somehow increases the challenge of dealing with it. And actually, in my perspective, this is the biggest trauma of Brazilian history. And on third person perspective, since the beginning of when the first Europeans arrived, Brazil is selling commodities. So it's wood and sugar and coffee and gold, and it's still the main export from Brazil. It's food and mining. So this is the big shadow of exploitation and exploration. And we could transform and see the values of the biodiversity and the water and the forest and the climate change, and make an economy driven by the idea of regeneration and the richness of the forest. So I'm going to explore a little bit more. So In terms of third person, before the Europeans arrived here, 100. Right now, there is estimation that there were 5 to 10 million people living here in more than 2,000 languages in 200 different indigenous population, which it was very rich with a totally different vision and values, perspective and beauty. Some of them were very sophisticated. Right now, we are just seeing this horrible moment where Yanomamis, one of the biggest population back in time, because of illegal mining allowed in the last 4 years, say that more than 30,000 of the Yanomamis died in the last years, and it's a tragedy. It is very sad to see. But I think, and then since the beginning, I'm not sure if you guys knew, but when Portugal arrived in Brazil, they were not interested in Brazil at that time. Interested in in arriving in India. 60 years, and Portugal was not paying too much attention to Brazil, and they rented Brazil for a company that started to exploit the world called Brazil. That's the country was named after. So, and there was this big and that company stayed in business for 100 years. First wood and then everything else. And it's been beginning, Brazil has been exploited. Actually, we see another huge possibility, and I think there's a sign of hope. For the first time, Lula, in his inauguration speech, said about an economy based on biodiversity. There is a growing movement with Brazilian scientists and NGOs and companies in Brazil and outside Brazil with this vision of Amazon being the Brazilian Silicon Valley, driven and creating economy out of, so instead of cutting forests and selling goods, the idea is how to create an economy based on the forest for pharmaceutical, nutritional, cosmetics, and materials goods. And it's I personally, I was senior vice president for Natura for 5 years, and then I worked very close with Amazon in the region, and I'm very excited about this possibility. It's a beautiful opportunity, and to me, the fact that right now there is Lula and there is Marina Silva in the environmental ministry, and there is an amazing group of people that is being dedicated his whole life for this. I think that for the first time there is a possibility of this idea unfold. Also, there is a growing movement in the agricultural and cattle around doing it from a sustainable perspective, which I think it's hopeful as well. So on the second person perspective, and to me, as I said, this is the biggest trauma. It is related to, I like the notion from a Jungian psychologist called Roberto Gambini, who wrote a book called The Brazilian Soul, because different from North America, first Europeans who met here, and because most of the indigenous living in Brazil, out of those 5 to 10 million, were from Tupi-Guaranis, they have a social structure that ended up engaging with white people, and having the daughters of the chiefs marrying some of the Europeans. So the first Brazilians are fruit of this relationship, although and somehow was abused, and then we created this psychic void in the Brazilian soul, which is the first Brazilians who are neither indigenous anymore, neither Europeans. So there was this kind of in terms of talking in terms of integral, there is this big hole in the purple, in the magenta. It is like we don't have the belonging necessary coming from the archetypal structure of belonging in the Brazilian soul, which creates this pain and the trauma that increases dramatically when the Portuguese start bringing African Americans enslaved. Brazil was the largest and the largest country in terms of bringing slaves from Africa, and also was the last one to abolish it. And after abolition, there was no social tissue or structure to include the African Americans. So again, here we have this lack of belonging just creating Brazilians what we call the stray dog syndrome. We always think that we value less than what we really believe we value. We look to US and Europe, and we are always saying that what's happening actually here in Portugal is better than what happened in Brazil. And I like the idea in one movement that started in Brazil with the notion of how we transform the idea of stray dog. Stray dog, instead of being less is more, because it's mixed, it's more resilient. So instead of using weakening ourselves in face of the rest of the world, strengthening ourselves grounded on the virtues. So this Brazilian virtues was part of a research that was made. There was the positive sides of Brazilians, and there is this movement, instead of mimicking US and Europe future projects, we can be prophetic, or so we can propose a project grounded in the Brazilian virtues, and it is, and then talking in integral terms, what would be a second tier future project based on regenerate ecosystems, but also regenerate relationships, and using the idea of mixed to heal and name our traumas, and also being open to spirituality and to transcendence. And this is the notion of first person. Brazilians in general, we are very open to spirituality. Transpersonal is very high in Brazil. Brazil is the only country in the world who has Umbanda and Candomblé, which were Christians and Christianity. Largest country in Spiritism, which was a religion coded in French, but it only happens in Brazil, which is great. This idea of Brazilians tend to being easy with the notion of transcendence. What happened then is that most of the times, or in some cases, Brazilians are influenced and manipulated for being childish in relationship with spirituality. But I think that this notion of proposing something that can transcend everything, can propose something to the world based on spirituality, can be something powerful. Okay, so I think I covered. Let me fast forward here, because I think I'm running out of time and I want to open to Q&A. We in CHE and Integral Institute, we are part of this movement to create these future projects for Brazil, and then we design what those what we call future scenarios, which is a second tier to strategy that instead of the traditional blue-orange approach to strategy, which is trying to find trends in the futures. The notion is how I embrace uncertainty, and I describe possible future scenarios that allows me to ask good questions and frame good problems instead of trying to solve them. So you see here two axes. One is if in the future, 2040, the Brazilian consciousness is still fragmented, so is still in the center of gravity of all the red, blue, orange, and green, or if we are going to have a more integrated second-tier perspective in power. On the vertical, it is if this distribution of wealth, the idea of inequality is more distributed, and more people are having a good life, or if we're going to keep concentrating, combination of it is so. And if you see fragmentation and wealth, so it's like we are going to be Miami. Brazilians love Miami, so we are going to be Miami. So if we have an integrated consciousness and wealth distribution, that's going to be what we are calling ancestral healing. So grounded on our history, we can deal and propose something new. So here in fragmented and concentration, we can keep perpetrating trauma, and it's pretty much the worst what we have been living in the last years. Or in the integrated consciousness and not in concentration of wealth, new age version of the same. So it's going to be a good Brazil for some, for a minority, but not really for most of people. Of course, when we see future, we are going to be in parts of everything, but the notion here and the proposal and what I want to bring for the conversation is, and open up for Q&A, is how we can, based on this possibilities and future possibilities, how we can ground ourselves and start working for something that it has never been working in Brazilian history, which is creating something unique that goes more toward the idea of this ancestral healing. And finally, I think the challenge is really dealing with, in one hand, the polarity of left and right, so dealing with the positive of individual responsibility and the freedom, which somehow it is being blinded by the far right, but there is a lot of good values on the right, and also on the social, there is more green, so there is good and beautiful on the blue orange agenda of right, and there is on the orange green of the agenda of left. And I think the challenge is here how we can have a purpose for the society, for the government, economy and democracy that is based on generation, that is can be more teal or yellow, talking in spiral dynamics terms. So I think this is it. I'm sorry I passed a little couple of minutes long, but I'm glad to open up conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcelo. So for leading us from the current situation back in the history and giving us some more perspectives for the future. So we have around 15 minutes for Q&A. It's not the part for discussion, but it's the chance to clarify or to deepening some issues you raised. So you know how it works. You have a virtual hand, you can raise it and then ask a question or comment. It is also good to have a moment of rest to digest what you said. Yes, Mark, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marcelo. Something which was really new and very enlightening for me is this aspect of ancestral healing or ancestral trauma. Depends how you call it. And my question would be, are there any signs in Brazil where there are attempts to heal this trauma?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that's a very good question, and I am also a facilitator in family organizational constellation, and I start following the work of Thomas Hubel from Germany and collective trauma back in some years ago, and then I start doing constellation on the traditional Brazilian trauma, which I think was something we did with Hans at the Integral European Conference. I think one of the main aspects that's based on this Brazilian void of our soul and the lack of belonging, it is very difficult for us to name and heal our traumas. I think for the first time, and it's starting now, and I think this is something that Lula has done well in terms of organizing his ministers. So because we have a minister for the traditional regional people, we have a minister for social justice and race for the first time. And I think for the first time, we are acknowledging that we have a structural racism far beyond what we have taught in terms of having as society. I think we are on the beginning in the inception of naming and dealing with it. I'm not sure how much time we are gonna, how much time it's necessary to heal with, but I see some signs of hope for the first time that we are, at least we are gonna name and deal with it in a way that has never been done before.
Lie down, and then Auke. Please lie down.
Yeah. Thanks, Marcelo, for your introduction. It was very interesting. I was stuck a little bit in the beginning because you were talking about the green in the power and about different movements, more from the left, Occupy and Spring. And then you said that there became chaos, and from this chaos, more right-wing movements started. I think that's very interesting, but can you be a little bit more precise about what happened so that we can see it here in the same way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think who I learned it from, me, it makes quite a lot of sense. If you take the Arabic Spring movement and then what came after, and then if you take Occupy Wall Street, and then if you take the social movement in Brazil back in 2013, it was like that we have those structures somehow ordered to. So let's take the Arabic Spring, that somehow we have very strong blue regimes at that time. So those regimes collapsed, and they allowed ISIS and everything else that we saw coming after. So we allow more red to emerge because we lack enough blue structure in the society. And in Brazil happened the same. So we, as I said, we are similar to South Africa. We have a lot of red, we have a lot of blue, we have a lot of orange and some green. And we had at that time Dilma as a president, and some structure going on, and a lot of green narrative. But then when this first started with students, because the price of public transportation was being raised by 20 cents. And so there was a kind of a redness for social movement to erupt. And then in the midst of the social movement happening, far right and right movements that were kind of dormant in Brazil for many, many years, starting leveraging and take advantage and collapsing the system. So, and they brought back something that was kind of dormant in Brazil, but very present, because Brazilians are very conservative. And I think the center of gravity of Brazil is blue. And then those guys were being left out. And out of anger, this movement triggered the red that Brazil has a lot in the society. And then that's why I say, and then I pretty much believe in it, that chaos infuses this huge amount of heat in the system and breaks structures. So when it fades back, usually fades back going backwards in a center of gravity before what the system had previously. With all the pathologies that is all together, right? It only happens because there are pathology. There is the stuff that is not integrated, right?
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Auke and afterwards Ilya. Please, Auke.
Good. Yeah, thanks, Marcelo. And with answering Lida's question, I think you've already touched upon a topic that I was want to ask you about. But so, because you're talking about the possibilities to go into the transpersonal and to to find basically second-tier solutions. And I was wondering, because as we see it, the earlier systems have to be healthy to move there. So what needs to happen in Brazil in order for that move? To me, it seems it will be too early for a movement like that. But what do you see that is required before you, to have a healthier system before you can move to something new?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a very good question. I'm not sure I'm gonna see it in this lifetime. It's happening. I think for the first time, I see people in leadership position holding second-tier consciousness and making decisions. In my opinion, we have serious pathology. I think we have both in the magenta or the purple, as I said, in the more archetypal Brazilian soul, this lack of belonging, which in some sense creates in Brazilian the sense of being nice and at the same time repressed anger. That's why we are violent. That's why we have so many homicides. And we don't have enough blue structure in place, which is to me, it is the scaffolding for a healthier society. So to me, the biggest challenge we are going to face is how we are going to have and create the blue scaffolding to allow the system to grow. And my hope is that there are some people in leadership and in political position in this group, which is not the case of Lula, which is not the case of most of people close to Lula, because those guys tend to blow blue structures. That's why it happens. It happened in the past. So they tend to deny the beauty and the importance of and the healthy version of blue. But there are people in some other areas doing the work. I'm not sure it's going to be enough, but in my lifetime is the first time that I see so many good second-tier people holding second-tier consciousness in powerful positions. So that's what gives me hope that those guys are being able to create structures that will make the systems healthier. So, but I'm not sure it's going to be for my lifetime.
And if you would have to describe the values sort of expression of Lula, what do you see there?
Well, that's a good conversation. That's a good question. So he's evolved. I think he matured after prison, and he's got married with a woman that is, I think that she has a lot of healthy green and some hints of, I think her growing edge is already yellow or teal, and I think she's influencing a lot him. For the first time, I see in his narrative aspects of healthy green around minorities, inclusion, division. The only issue I think it is hard. I read a couple of biographies from Lula, and then I met him 3 or 4 times. He has such a structural elements in his childhood that is traumatic. I'm not sure it's gonna be integrated in this lifetime, which I think from time to time he regresses from a place of anger and counterattack. Right now I see him more orange-green, but when he's triggered, he regresses back and in a place that is not healthy, and that's what I'm afraid what's going on right now. I think he loses part of his best functioning under pressure, and then right now he's under a lot of under pressure, right?
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Ilya from Zurich.
Yes, thank you, Marcelo, for the presentation. I was a bit battered by seeing all these challenges ahead. What I see at the moment is we put them all in the same bucket, the kind of society, but my perception is that the Brazilian society at the moment is in a split and drifting apart even more strongly. Do you see anything? Because before, I think you even go in any of those 4 directions, I think they have to come together, right? Because otherwise, I think otherwise it explodes or even implodes. So the question to me was, do you see any answers to that on how to bring this huge gap within society closer?
Actually not. I think what's going on, and actually it's the first month of the new government, we had a very serious threat of a coup here. And there was very high level military people involved. There was business people involved in it, so financing the movement. So there was a threat to democracy. And at the same time, as you said, 58 million people voted for Bolsonaro, because Lula has a very strong rejection because of the corruption charges that he faced. So I I don't know. I don't have a answer for you, and I think that is the biggest challenge that we are going to have 4 years from now. Because in one hand, I see those guys taking power right now, doing all the right things, at least in my perspective, to have a government for the whole and have a more high-level agenda. But on the other hand, I see also them making the same mistakes of excluding part of those guys from the narrative and the conversation. So I don't know. That is, I think, and actually, I don't think this is the question only for Brazil, because if you see US, what happened in the midterms elections and the guy who was elected president of the Congress. We are just talking before about Turkey, also Hungary, India. So I think there is this global pattern unfolding, which is I'm not sure how we're going to deal with it. At the end of the day, I like the notion that it is only evolution happening, and then we are alive in this lifetime at this moment, and yet there are threats and risks that we don't know how we're going to handle, right?
Okay, there's one more question from Barbara.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Marcelo, for joining us tonight. It's really interesting hearing you. And I would like to kind of pick your brain or hear your views on kind of like the integration of the order or the blue, like the healthy blue within Brazil. Because when I look at what happened the last 20 years, we went from red to orange to green, back to blue, back to orange, back to red, and now trying to go back to green, integrating in different ways. So like the military period in Brazil is some blue or trying to keep some order, but then the laws never apply to everyone in Brazil. So applies to some, right? And the reason I'm asking you this question to you is like, would it be great if it were like cyclical or a spiral that would keep going forward, but we go forward and backwards at the same time? I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but like when I look at the Bolsonaro or Bolsonarismo raising up, and I talked to various colleagues from various streams, what I heard is, well, the military were always very keen to come back to power. So they just saw an opportunity. They never left politics. And this was just an institutionalized opportunity to come back. And then all this anger, I was like, is this a red shadow that we never incorporated because of all the trauma that you introduced to us at the beginning? Or is it something else? You know, so I'm curious about how do we make sense of the complexity of having all those levels living together, a lot of shadow, a lot of trauma. And what I think is not peculiar to Brazil, but very current, is we do one, like politicians doing one thing and saying one thing and doing another. I hope that makes sense as a question, because it's more like a comment and a reflection, but I wonder what do you make of it? And what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you, Barbara. And I think that at a more deep level, structural level, it all goes back to our traumas unhealed, and actually more than not healing our traumas, we don't name it. And actually we all know that when we don't name a trauma, we try to live as if it doesn't exist. And then that's why, because we don't name it, we create this big shadow in red. To me, because we don't heal and name the trauma of rejection and exclusion in purple, we trigger an unhealed version of red, and that's why we have this face of being nice and connecting. We have this big shadow of violence that is unintegrated. And to me, we are just from time to time, from crisis to crisis, we are always and actually this is the issue I study a lot on trauma with. So when you have, as Thomas Hubel says, trauma graded becomes a destiny, which is, to me, this is the biggest aspects of our past. So our incapacity to name and heal and talk about it and integrate it and create structure to deal with our traumas in a way that is healthy and inclusive and integrated. And then corruption, violence, and everything that you mentioned, which I agree, all goes back to this origin, in my perspective.
Okay, thank you so far. I think this was a very interesting and rounding off of your introduction. So we will have a 10 minutes break. We will meet again at 8:30 and we will digest your insights in small groups. So please be back in 10 minutes. Then we have an exercise in the groups for half an hour and then we gather the information. Yeah, the insights of the groups we share together. Good. In 10 minutes.
Is there, I would suggest, is there just a brief, well, summary of thing, it was something which you would like to give back to the whole group from your subgroup? So that's a question to all of you.
I can briefly summarize, because Thais gave a very great analysis just like now in the past 3 minutes, I think, because what we were discussing is like we see those two camps in Brazil, which are very extremist. And then we asked ourselves the question, well, how can you even encounter these very strong reds in these both camps? And then Florian said, well, there are only these two camps in Brazil. There's nothing in between. And then Thais said, well, look, there are those two camps, but most of the people are somewhere in between. But you can only choose between those two at the moment. And then we spoke a little bit. We connected it to spiral dynamics. So we said, well, to encounter the red, it would need a healthy kind of blue. And Thais said that would be like a center right, basically. And at the moment, there is no center right anymore. So from a political sense, a center right. And at the moment, she said there was in the past, but at the moment, there's no new center right that you can choose from. There are very old people in there, but they are not powerful anymore. And so most of the people, she said, there are 60 million people that voted for Bolsonaro. She speaks to them, and they are not so extremist, but they're just looking for a little bit more law, order, structure in place, and that you can only choose between those two. And it was just like did I summarize it right, Thais, or anything to add?
No, that's it. This was the best thing I heard about this thing. Lula represents the center left, and the extremists on the left. They are not so dangerous, in Brazil. They're not so loud now. But the center right, he doesn't capture, because it's more liberal, and so we have a lack of representation. The MDB, for the Brazilians, or the ones who know, MDB is super weak and they don't do their job, and so maybe we need something there, Okay, sorry.
Thank you for this addition. Other people would like to share some insights which came out of your subgroup.
Well, in our group, we also had the conversation about the lack of the blue system. And what was insightful to me, Marcelo, is that where you pointed how the revolutions, like the Arab Spring, actually killed the blue system, and sort of left the chaos. And one of the things that came up in our group, because if we look at Eastern Europe, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was also a collapse of the blue system, right? And I don't know Brazil at all, but I do know Eastern Europe quite well, and what I've seen in that is that it had to collapse. It was a fake blue system, right? It was, I mean, the whole communism was hollow. Nobody really believed in it, and it was just, but you had to, because it was the law, sort of thing, and then it collapsed. And that, of course, yeah, brings up the question, what's next? And in response to what you were just sharing, I think that another dimension, this is something that we didn't discuss, but it's Don talked a lot about splitting the zealots from the moderates, right? So I think that's something that probably is here. That's what I'm hearing as well here, is that you go, so the fight is between the extremists, but in between, actually, most people are moderates. And so whatever intervention would happen, it would have to split the zealots, the extremists from the moderates, on both left and right. And then you can, because also, I mean, center left can be blue too as well. The socialist is very strong blue, so it's called the assimilation contrast effect that Don talked about. And of course, how to do it, I have no clue, because we can analyze it, but we don't have the copyright, we don't have the the authority, power, or influence to do anything in this system, which is deeply frustrating. Yeah.
Any other comments or reflections in relation to the subgroups?
We were talking as well about the question of trauma and how deep that goes and how difficult it is to heal it, really, because it goes over generations, and the urge of getting things done in relation to time which is needed to heal is quite frustrating too.
Yeah.
So it's not hopeless, I think, because there's always hope. Not as general, but there is, of course, there are possibility. Everybody is aware of this situation, or would be aware, or more aware of it. We would be able to act differently, and that would make already a change in a way in the micro system. In the macro system, it's we don't see very much light at the end of the tunnel.
Leila.
Yeah, I want to add something from my little group. All my observations. You also already mentioned that. So the first one was for me about the purple and the trauma. And I found it very interesting that Marcelo said, okay, the first step you have to do is to give the traumas a name. And somehow that made me a little bit hopeful about the Netherlands at this moment, because one of the things that is happening is mentioning the traumas about Indonesia, about the Jews in the World War II, about women, about racism, about slavery, and it's just all beginning, it's starting, but it's something that is being discussed on different levels. And I think, okay, probably that's anyway a positive development then. And maybe it can have the effect of creating more healthy purple also. don't know. So the other thing was about the blue, and I think the healthy blue is the fundamental of each society, and where it collapsed, it has to be built again somehow. And that's something that green doesn't want to, because we don't want the higher green, we don't want this. Okay, but it's needed. And so this can be a kind of mission, say. And I find it very interesting what you just said about the politics. But why? I think in the Netherlands it's the same. So the middle parties are going away to the sides. Okay, why can't we bring it back somehow? It's some yeah. I also don't know how to do it, but it's a kind of perspective. And in fact, it's playing out on a lot of different sectors. For instance, education in the schools. We in the Netherlands, we have a very green educational system, and for some children that works very well, but maybe, no, I don't know, but I think it's very interesting. And I think it's these developments, or these these processes are playing, it seems, everywhere in the world now.
Thank you, Leila. Barbara, you raised your hand.
Yeah, so it's pretty cool because thank you, Lars, and thanks everyone for sharing. I think it's following up on what Marcelo just mentioned. Like when I hear you say, oh, well, where do we intervene? It's so huge. Well, it depends. If you take a complexity lenses and you look into it, you need just entry points. And if you don't work in the material world, which is us as consultants going to meetings and doing agendas, but we work at the energy level through constellations, through other like meta type of work, it's completely workable. Like it's super, super workable. So I mean, I work on Brazil issues all the time. And I mean, we have Thais on the call as well. I feel completely empowered, but it's not me, Barbara, doing the work. It's me and all the organizations and the networks and the people at the Umbanda centers doing religious work, and the trauma healers and the ones naming things, and the activists and the youth. Yeah, and blue. Brazil has a governance system. We may lack parties. We have a Supreme Court. We have a Congress, no matter the composition. We trust the courts to a certain level. So there is a governance system in place. There is blue there. There is orange. There is business, striving business. There is entrepreneurs. There is creativity going on. There is people going to school, to universities. And then, of course, there are dispossessed and the excluded. That's where we need green to bring everybody in, right? And there is yellow at play, and all of that is coexisting. So I do think that the trauma invitation sounds great, and I do think that integrating shadows and broken parts through constellations and internal family systems in a group is very powerful. And I'm super excited by this conversation. So thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Doorbell is going, but ignore that. Anyone else would like to add something for now? Otherwise, I would suggest you just make one step. That is sort of exploration of a question. And the question is, what is the meaning of this salon for the world? So things have already been said, but it maybe can just if you just become silent and digest on what everything what's been said, shared. What is the meaning of this Salon for the World? And the invitation is to speak from silence. Just bring in your voice when it's clear. You feel the energy.
Well, can I start? I think what comes back to me is what we said in the conversation before the salon started, is that how to phrase that? If I live in any country where things are not so democratic, right, or where they struggling or whatever, and I'm driven from purple and red, or red values, or a combination, right? I don't have a how to say, from Spiral, we would want to bring in healthy blue, healthy orange, healthy green, right? Because that would be a way to progress the system, to deal with some of the issues, to go to, I mean, the world needs, and eventually needs, yellow solutions. So we will need somehow that pathway to get there, right? If we all live in a red chaos, there's never any way we're going to deal with the climate crisis. So we do need some level of green, some level of yellow. But if I live in these countries, I don't get a good example of that. I don't get a perspective other than the riches of some of the rich people. I mean, of course, some countries will have a lot better living standard. That's true. But if the Western world keeps guiding their morals based on economics, there's no moral authority that they have. So we will need to really clean up our act as Western countries, if we want to contribute to at least being let's say, give blue, orange, green some moral authority, and to give a perspective to countries that are more chaotic than ours. And maybe we don't manage, maybe we all sink back into the chaos like the United States almost did, or maybe still doing, I don't know, right? But that's the only way forward, right? And part of that conversation was where I was talking to some friends in Turkey about the situation in Ukraine. And rather than seeing, the West help a country prevent being taken over by Russia, what they see is a corrupt West helping Ukraine, and they don't trust the intentions of the Western countries there. So maybe because of what Ukraine, but because of what's happened many other places in the world, and
This moral authority And I think it's good to discern it from political authority, because otherwise it becomes maybe very difficult. But the need for a kind of moral authority, blue with orange and green mixed, somehow I think it means that we will become very straight in what we about our opinions. Let's say in the Green Collective, there's a kind of freedom, and okay, that's your opinion, that's your opinion. So there is no moral authority. If we want the moral authority back, it becomes more important to be very clear and what are moral values, ethical values that somehow are healthy for the whole society, and to be clear on that, and not to let everyone free in what they think. And it's easy to say this, it's not easy to do, but I think that's important.
I was thinking about the theory of genre, and before going down into the U, the first step is observe, 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 and this is what helped me today. And observe means to come to a multi-perspective view on what's going on, yeah? And to recognize the patterns which we can see, which we can recognize from Israel, from Turkey, from the Ukraine, from Brazil, from America, and also Germany, yeah. And by this observation, by the sharing of these observations, yeah, it helps me to observe myself, yeah, and it helps me not to go into one polarity or the other polarity, yeah, and yeah, to stay with my own values. And it's related again to genre, to protect myself, so that I can stay in my strengths. So it's such a big force which could drawing you down, yeah. And yeah, and I have some friends, and they see the world as the Titanic, yeah. And I don't want to go into this sinking, yeah. Yeah. So and I liked also what Marcello wrote. So awareness is already a part of the healing. So what we are doing here in the salon and in other places, yeah, is a part of the healing, I believe in. So let's go on. Yeah, don't give up, continue what we see and try to name it.
I think that was a very good last word. Really.
Yeah. In a way, it feels round, like now things have been said, which I think it's nice to round up now and just thank you all for participating, being present, being here, and broaden your own awareness or consciousness or whatever. Oh, we can't. Well, Marcelo, in the chat, he wrote some things so you can read about. Also about trauma thing and other things. Just where you had to leave. So can't take him personally anymore. But so just one thing I would like to say is that if you have any suggestions for follow-up of these salons or other ideas, feel free to approach us. We like to organize meetings like these. I'd like to thank you, Hans, for arranging our guest speaker, and well, again, thank you all for being here, and sleep well if it's evening, or have a nice day if it's early in the day. And, success digesting this salon. With that,
Thanks.
Yes, bye-bye.
Thank you very
all.
much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I left the song for you to close
Yes.
and connect to the Brazilian soul.
Super. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
Nice.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you for organizing.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Tot ziens.
Bye.